On this episode of the Dubcast, part of the Roundball Australia podcast network, we have a very special guest for you today. She is one of the most prominent voices in women's football, a well-respected journalist who has since shifted gears within the industry to become the impact manager at Women Onside, as well as president of the Flying Bats Football Clubs, where she's also a player. My name is Poletti, and we'll tackle all of that and so much more as we welcome Sam Lewis onto the Dubcast today. Sam, welcome to the Dubcast.
Thanks, Poletti. So nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is an interview I've been wanting to do for a while. You know, we're friends. I've seen so much of your journey, and you've been such an influential figure to me, and I wanted to share that story, with the rest of the footballing world. And I think the best place to start there is how you got into football. If memory serves me correctly, it was the 2005 shootout against Uruguay, correct?
Yeah, so look, I've played football all my life, right? Like I played since I was a kid. I have memories of having to play in boys' teams because my association out in Macarthur didn't have girls' teams when I was young. And there were some pretty, radicalizing moments for me when I was part of those boys' teams as the only girl. But the really clear memory for me that stands out is, as you mentioned, 2005, which I think was a moment in time for the whole game in Australia, really. Like, I don't know a football person who doesn't remember that and who doesn't remember, like, exactly where they were when that moment happened. It's that the same as the Courtney Vine penalty win against France at the World Cup, right? Like, everyone knows where they were. So for me, I was, 12, maybe, 13. My mum allowed me to stay up late in order to watch the shootout of the game. I remember sitting on my knees, watching the television in my living room, like shaking with nerves, which is something that I hadn't really experienced in any kind of sporting way before. And when I remember two specific moments. The first was when Mark Schwarzer saved a particular penalty right towards the back end of the shootout, because I remember, and I still remember, the sound of the ball hitting his glove. And I don't know why I remember that, but it was just so... It just was so profound to me and made such an impact on my psyche. And then the second moment, of course, was John Aloisi scoring the winning pen. And the reason why I remember it is not because of what happened on the television, but because of what happened in my neighborhood. I heard houses from around the block cheering because we were all watching the same moment, the same penalty. And I think for the first time in my life, really outside of the 2000 Olympics, when I watched Kathy Freeman win the gold medal, it felt like I was part of something so much bigger than what I realized. This was so much more than just me playing on a Sunday with my friends. This was a game, a sport, a team that had such universal appeal and was able to bring so many people from a really diverse community like mine, where I grew up in Campbelltown, all together into the same moment of celebration. So that was really significant for me. That was like the moment that I became what I would like to term a football person. That really, that inspired me, that game.
Yeah, it's a funny story, because so a lot of people won't know this, but they'll know this now. We both grew up in the same area. We both grew up in Campbelltown. We're both Campbelltown kids. They make us different out here, as Alana Kennedy shows. They certainly make us different out here. And I very much recall similar experiences to what you did, playing in a boys' team that had one or two girls in it. And, I think something that didn't really stick with me at the time, but sticks with me now, is when the girls that were on my team actively chose to leave the club to go play in a girls' team because they didn't want to play with boys anymore. And, I was looking at it as I lost a friend who was playing for a different club, not so much looking at it in the broader context of, everything that goes on around it now, which I understand now in hindsight. I can sort of relate to challenges that you would have gone through from the other perspective of it, where, you're looking at it as losing a friend rather than, the idea of, the greater socio-economic gender diversity problems that come with community football, particularly at that age. And hopefully things have changed now at a junior level, but
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a really similar experience, I think, for a lot of women and gender diverse people of my age. I'm in my sort of early to mid 30s now, and I've got a lot of friends who have really similar stories. It's actually not that long ago, when you think about it, that we didn't have girls teams at community football clubs, particularly those who were sort of under-resourced, those who were sort of a little bit further out of the cities. And yeah, like it was just something, if you loved football and you were a girl, you just had to go and play with whatever was available. And, thankfully I had a club, Escol Park Wolves, Go Wolves, who, were really accepting of me, and they gave me opportunities when I was a kid to play with the boys team for a number of years. But it got to the point where I wanted to play with my other friends, and you start getting older, and that's when, the gendering of sport starts to become a lot more structured, and you can no longer play with the boys, all these friends that you've made over the years. You have to go and play in a girls team because that's how you're assigned. And that's sort of a much bigger topic that we can talk about later. We don't have to talk about it either, but yeah, the way in which sport is structured along such binary gender lines is something that really bothers me. And it's something that, as we'll mention later with my role at the Bats, has some pretty significant consequences for people as well.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy topic to discuss. But maybe that's another podcast entirely on itself. That's probably a 2-hour chat all by itself. Yeah. We'll go back to you becoming a football person. How did that then expand into your love for women's football? Because obviously 2005, it was when the A-League men's competition was starting. There's still the WNSL had sort of just folded. There wasn't really that, I guess, top flight women's competition to follow for a few years left. How did that sort of time period lead to you finding women's football?
There was nothing. I had no idea who the Matildas were. I had no idea that there were any sort of top flight women's competitions happening anywhere, because it just wasn't visible. It wasn't shown on television. No, there was no media around it. There was nothing. So, I followed the Socceroos for a very long time because of that first game, that 2005 win against Uruguay. When the A-League men started, I started to pay a little bit more attention to it. I watched a lot of Premier League. Liverpool was my club, and 2005 was sort of the time that I started paying attention to them as well, and watching, highlights and midnight games on SBS, on the World Game, when they used to broadcast it, RIP. But my entry point into the women's game came largely because I started to pay more attention to my local representative NPL women's team, which was the Macarthur Rams. And, when I was playing with my friends, as I went up the age groups in the women's comp, some of the players who came and joined our team were ex-Rams players, and they would speak so highly about, all these amazing players that they played with on their teams, and how great it is that this is a program that's really developing, and the Rams seem to really care about their women's program. And I was like, oh yeah, that sounds really cool. I remember trialing for the Macarthur Rams even when I was younger. I think I trialed as a defender, because I was a defender back then, but they actually wanted me to be a goalkeeper because I was tall. And I said no, because I loved running around on the field with my friends. I didn't want to stand in goal and do nothing. So who knows what sliding doors moment that was and where I could have been now had I said yes. But I started to attend NPL women's games at my local Rams facility, which was Linwood Park. So on a Sunday afternoon, I would usually play at 9 or 11 or 1 o'clock. I would race home and scoff some post-game lunch, usually a huge tin of tuna and toast, and then I would drive out to Linwood Park for the 3 p.m. kickoff for the Macarthur Rams women. And I would be sitting in the grandstand there alongside maybe, a handful of family and friends and a couple of kookaburras. No one was there, no one cared, no one knew that it was happening. And, after going to these games for a number of seasons and watching how amazing these players were, those were ex-Matildas in this team. You had Teresa Polias, you had Lena Karmas, you had Kylie Ledbrook, Renee Rollison. You had some players who were quite extraordinary athletes and had these amazing stories. And they were playing so beautifully together as well. This was the golden era of the Macarthur Rams women's team. But no one cared. No one was writing about the championships they were winning. No one was coming to their games to watch them at home. Not even their own social media accounts were posting anything about it. There was nothing on their Facebook page. They had a Twitter account that was completely inactive. So in a sort of sense of righteous rage, I just started tweeting about the games. I would go along, I would take photos, I would film videos, I would come up with hashtags, I would just like live tweet the games from my own personal Twitter account, thinking that surely there are going to be people out there who also want to know what's going on in these matches beyond me. And it turns out I was right. And one of the tactics that I had was that I wanted to try and track down who actually owned the MacArthur Rams Twitter account. Because it had like a couple hundred followers, but they hadn't posted anything for years. And so I had to go through this series of conversations, going to the MacArthur Rams admin, like sending them emails and messages online, going to the clubhouse even one afternoon and just like bundling up some guy who was there, who I think was like the one of the directors or something, and asking him, do you know who runs this account? And then over a series of months, I ended up tracking down the person who owned it, sending them a few messages saying, hey, like, I'm really keen to take this over in order to live tweet women's games. Would you be able to give me the logins? And she was like, totally, yeah, go for it. Like, I don't have time to do this anymore. So that's what happened. Like, I transferred all of my energy from my own Twitter account to the, unofficial, but semi-official MacArthur Rams women's Twitter account, and did that as well for a season or two. And so, like, doing all of that, and meeting all of these players and really starting to recognize the power of these stories made me pay so much more attention to what then emerged as the W League. The Western Sydney Wanderers had just brought in a women's team, and they were sort of the closest club to me. So that was actually my first dub team, was the Wanderers. I went and bought tickets. I went to games out west, and yeah, like brought along some of my friends from football as well. And that's sort of how I got started.
I wish I could say that things have changed, with MacArthur Rams NPL women's games, but having spent some time there in the last few weeks on my days off when I haven't been calling games, it's the same group of people all turning up, and yeah, I wish I could say they were generating more of a crowd, but sadly they're not. And that's coming off the back of 3 straight grand final wins, so it's not great. And as someone who loves watching all these players, like, I'm literally seeing the next generation come through before my eyes. There's a lot of talent in that MacArthur Rams side, but I see this everywhere I go, in NPL women's. It's just, it's sort of, I don't want to say been left behind by the World Cup, but it's sort of like it hasn't kicked on down the pyramid, right? And we've seen the growth at A-League women's games, but that hasn't translated to, I guess, the community level as much as you'd like to hope that it would have. I mean, a year before Courtney Vine scored that penalty, she was literally playing at Peter Moore Field for Sydney Olympic, and in front of like 10 people and a dog. And I would like to say that's an exaggeration, but
no,
I mean, I've seen some of the crowds at Sydney Olympic at Peter Moore Field, and it's not great.
I remember watching Courtney Vine dragging a wheelie bin full of corner flags around the Valentine Sports Park facility when she was playing for Sydney Uni. I remember these players coming from nowhere, and so many of them are still in the same position, which is like, you wouldn't have thought that would be the impact that the Women's World Cup would have made. You would have hoped that tournament really would have elevated the pathways that we have available for women players to come through and given them more attention and more opportunity for crowds to build around them and for fan bases to form. But it just hasn't happened. And to me, it's quite indicative of, I think, a deeper problem that Australian soccer has, which is that there is a real misalignment between a lot of the different levels of the pyramid and a lot of the different sort of governing bodies that are responsible for making decisions about how to move their particular space forward. Because everyone's got their own idea of how to make the game better, right? But no one is willing to actually sit down with one another and talk about how to come to agreement about what that way is.
Yeah, I think that's what happens. Like, I think of the kitchen analogy, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, but we've also seen that trying to streamline it doesn't have the best success either. So it's you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Yeah, that's it.
You then eventually moved into football journalism, taking that passion that you had for the game to bring stories to a wider audience. But you weren't supposed to be a football journalist. You had no plans to be a football journalist, right?
No plans at all. I was at university studying literature for a very, very long time. I did my undergrad in literature and philosophy, and then I went on to do a master's and even got halfway through a PhD. in literary studies before having an opportunity to start writing a bit more about women's football. But what I was doing in parallel with my research was I was writing for fun. You know, the first person who sort of noticed me and gave me an opportunity was Anne O'Dong, friend of the pods, Anne O'Dong, who was the founder of the Women's Game website, the original Women's Game website. And, you know, I was connected with her thanks to all of my tweeting about the MacArthur Rams. And she gave me an opportunity to start writing some longer form blog posts on the Women's Game website, talking about whatever I wanted to talk about, really. So I would start watching, you know, Youth Matildas games. I'd start watching W League games. I'd watch more MPL women's games and do match reports and interviews and sort of think pieces and analysis pieces and opinion pieces about, like how I was sort of experiencing the game and what I was thinking about what needed to happen to move it forward. But I was doing all this for free. I was doing all this because I loved it and because I had my sort of career path vaguely emerging over in this academic world. My intention was to get a PhD and then work in universities forever. And then I had this other thing, which was a space where I could really have so much joy in my writing. I could engage in something that I had participated in at the community and grassroots level since I was a kid. You know, it gave me so much different kinds of like emotional fulfillment that it almost didn't matter that I wasn't getting paid. I just loved the opportunity to talk about it and to make friends through this shared experience that we were having, through this shared love of women's football. So I'm very indebted to Anne for giving me those opportunities and for spending so much time with me as well, sitting down with me some nights and spending an hour or so going through a draft story that I'd written. You know, we would comb through sentence after sentence after sentence and would say, you know, I think like this is a really great start. Maybe we can add this. Maybe we can slightly tweak the language here. You know, she really taught me the craft of the basics of storytelling in the context of sport. And that was really important for me because I had spent so much of my sort of professional life up until that point writing in a very academic way. That was how I'd been trained. And so she was able to sort of massage that academia out of me a little bit and make me a little bit more of a conversational, personality-driven writer. And I think that has been incredibly formative for me because that is the way in which I've approached the rest of my journalism career as well, is taking the strength that I had developed as an academic and my communication skills there, my ability to make an argument, my ability to draw on examples and resources and evidence, but also framing that in a particular way that is much more accessible for people to read who might not be familiar with the kind of jargon or like complex language that an academic context encourages you to have. So yeah, I spent a couple of years writing for the Women's Game and doing all sorts of things there. The Women's Game eventually evolved to become Beyond 90. And so I was part of the sort of the leadership team there. I was in charge of the social media coverage that Beyond 90 was doing for a lot of the competitions. And as these two sort of paths of my life continued on, I realized that in the football media space, there was so much more opportunity. There were so many more people who were really engaged and really interested, and a community that was really flourishing around this world. Whereas in academia, I was almost going in the opposite direction. Like I was, when you do a PhD, you know, you choose something very, very niche, really, and you're producing a piece of work that's going to be relevant to like a very small handful of peers in the higher education world. So yeah, like I got to a sort of point where I was being afforded more and more opportunities to write about women in football, including more paid opportunities as well. I think the first paid story that I did was commissioned by Football New South Wales, and it was to write a match report of their women's grand final from, years and years and years ago. I can't even remember it now, but I think we got maybe $120 for writing that match report, which was like such a buzz. You know, it's absolute peanuts now, but an incredible sort of thing to finally be like acknowledged for the work that you've been doing and to have some sort of financial reward for that. And so that was sort of the time when I was like, hang on, like maybe this could be something. Like maybe this could be a bit more of an opportunity for me than just something that I'm doing as a hobby. And so I, started to reach out to more and more organisations. Before the 2019 Women's World Cup in France, I was invited to put together like a preview story of all the competing nations for a now defunct football magazine, which we got paid for as well. And then right before the tournament started, I'd taken some time off from my PhD to go to France with a couple of friends. It was just meant to be a holiday, just to go and like watch my first ever World Cup live, follow the Matildas through France. And just before it started, it was when Optus Sport had opened up here in Australia, and they were the broadcasters of the Women's World Cup there. And I remember they posted a tweet asking for content for their website, because they were broadcasting the tournament, but they didn't really have sort of a staff. They didn't really have anyone behind the scenes to write stuff. So I replied to them and I was like, hey, like I'm going to the tournament that you're broadcasting, so maybe I could write about, what it's like to follow the Matildas through France, some kind of like travel, sport, blog type of thing. And they were like, yeah, sounds great. Like, we'll pay you this amount of money, just like, produce as much content as you want, send it to it at this email address and like have fun. And I was like, oh crap. Okay. All right. Now I have to actually do it. So the trip to France ended up being a kind of working holiday for me. I wrote a series called The View from the Cheap Seats, which was about my experience following the Matildas through France as a fan, and the sort of heartbreak of that tournament as well. And yeah, I sort of like typed up these stories in the Airbnbs and flats and apartments that we were staying in, and sent them off into the night. But never sort of checked about like what happened with them, where they were posted, anything like that, until I got home. And when I got home, I had all of these messages and emails from people being like, we really loved your writing. Like, this was so great. Would you be interested in doing, X, Y, Z about the Matildas, about the W League, about whatever else is going on? And I was like, sure, hell yeah. Like, let's go. Let's see what this could be about. So within a couple of months, I'd reached out to all the sport editors that I could track down the contact details of through some of my friends. And I emailed all of them and I was like, hey, like we've just had this really cool tournament. The Matildas are starting to sort of get a bit of traction in Australia. What are you doing about it? Like, are you covering the Matildas now? Are you covering the W League? What does this look like? And how can I help? How can I be part of this? What can I do? Like, I'll do it for free. I don't really care what it is. Which I do not recommend. Always try and ask for money for your work. But back in those days, I was just like, I just want to give myself as much opportunity as possible in this short window of time to just go 110% at this and see what sticks. And within a couple of months, probably by the end of that year, I was writing regularly for The Guardian. I was writing regularly for Optus. I was writing for ESPN. I was having opportunities with SBS as well, with ABC. And it got to the point where I had to have a conversation with my PhD supervisor. And I was like, hey, like, this feels like an avenue that's starting to open up for me. Like, what should I do? I was halfway through my thesis and I was in a space that was quite niche. I was also quite burnt out. The topic of my research was very heavy. And my supervisor, God bless him, Toby Davidson, he said to me, you know what? Higher education is a bin fire right now. This seems like it's a pathway that's really starting to flourish. Women's football around the world seems like it's really taking off. And if you can position yourself now in a way where you become one of the expert voices of the game, that could be an incredible platform for you to thrive and to move into this next stage of your career. And so that's what I did. Quit my PhD, decided to freelance full time, and now here we are.
So much of what you just said sticks out to me. Like, yep, I can relate to that. I can relate to that. I can relate to that. Yep, I completely and totally and utterly agree with this, which I think it's both a good thing and a bad thing. Like, it's a good thing that, the experience hasn't changed too much, but I also think it's a bad thing that the experience hasn't changed too much, because we're going through the same things, not getting paid for work, not, like being one of only a handful of people actually in press boxes. But we'll move on in, the idea of you eventually turned all that freelancing into a full-time role with the ABC. You wrote some fantastic stories during your time at the Auntie, including a deep dive on North Korea, which we'll put a link to in the description, and I would heavily recommend it if you haven't read it already. It is one of the best pieces of work I read, over the last 12 months. What was your time like at the ABC as a whole? Because you were there for 3 years, I think.
3 years, yeah. Look, my time at the ABC was amazing. It was an incredible organisation to be part of, considering where I had come from. I came from a world of, spending years freelancing, spending years scrapping to try and earn enough money to pay my bills, to pay my rent. And so to be in a role like that one with an organisation that was so supportive, that had so much faith in its journalists, and that had such a history and so much trust with the broader Australian public was an incredible privilege. My theory is that they hired me because at that point we already knew that we were going to be co-hosting the 2023 Women's World Cup, and they didn't have any women's football experts in their staff. So I think when I applied for the role, there were two or three of the same role that were going at the same time. And so I think they were quite strategic in trying to fill those roles with people who were in the kinds of spaces that the public broadcaster would need to be entering into over the next couple of years. And women's football was one of them. So it was really great timing, I think, for me. And when I got there, it's always really difficult, I think, going from a place like freelancing where you're your own boss, you dictate your own stories, your own timeframes, you do all your own work and you make all your own decisions, to then being part of this huge machine where you've got so many layers of approval above you, lots of editors and managers around you, and a lot less autonomy than what you were used to. It took me quite a while to sort of adjust to that. But the payoff is that you have this incredible platform to be able to share these stories that mean so much to you with millions and millions of people. And so I really threw myself into it. I taught myself about, putting together social media stuff. I did a lot of radio. I drew upon all of my drama kid energy to pretend to be good at television for a while. And that was all incredible. It was so wonderful to see the way in which the broader community that was flourishing around women's football, really appreciating the voice that I was giving it at the ABC, because it had been such a long time, if ever, that women's football had a presence there. And for the national broadcaster to be ignoring such a huge space of the game, a space of the game that was really starting to rapidly evolve as well and attract more and more fans. I think there were, including me, I was very grateful for the opportunity to be there and to be flying that flag. And the great thing is that they, especially my old editor, Kyle Pollard, he had so much faith in me, and he really knew that if he gave me time and if he gave me resources, I would be able to tell some really good stories. And that North Korea story, I think, is the perfect example of that. Like, that took me a really long time to put together, partly because there's just no information out there about the North Korean football program at all. But also because it was such a long piece of writing, and I wanted it to be a long piece of writing because it was a story that really required a lot of time, and it required that kind of untangling of everything that's going on. And when I pitched the idea to my editor, he was like, "That sounds amazing. Like, go and do it. I trust you." And that was so great to have that kind of faith. Doing the live blogs as well was one of my favorite things. I loved the chance to really deliberately and directly engage with people who were watching Matilda's games in particular, and A-League women's finals and things, having comments coming through, being a lot more personality driven in that kind of storytelling, being really live and active and fun with it as well. That was a real blast doing all of that. But I think the things that started to sort of wear me down a little bit about working there was that the ABC are quite strict in terms of their social media policy. It's something that a lot of former ABC journalists have complained about after they've left the building. It's very restrictive in what you can and can't say. And the reasons why are never really spelled out properly to you. And so for me, given the other hat that I began to wear when I joined the ABC, which was my Flying Bats hat, issues around LGBTQIA plus rights and representation, and particularly conversations around the inclusion of trans and gender diverse people in sport, that's something that means an extreme amount to me personally. and it's something that I wanted to use my personal platform in order to talk about and to, advocate for. But that caused some tension behind the scenes with the ABC. And it was really difficult for me to navigate that because in effect, it made me feel like I was being asked to suppress a part of my identity and a part of the things that I believed in the interests of impartiality, which is a nice word that is often used by organisations in the media to try and make it seem as though there are two equal sides to a debate, when in fact, when it comes to human rights, there is only one correct side, and that is the side of freedom and inclusion and equality. So yeah, that became quite hard. But it also, I think, post World Cup, I started to sort of feel like I was repeating myself a lot. I started to get a little bit frustrated with the fact that after the tournament was over, it didn't really feel like much was changing. I felt like I was complaining about the same old things in Australian soccer. I felt like I was repeating myself a lot in some of the stories I was telling. And that became really disheartening. And so that kind of feeling, I thought it was just post-World Cup blues. I thought it was just the come down that you often get after covering a major tournament, but it lingered. And I'm not one to sort of settle and to just sort of like go with it and hope that it's something that changes by itself. I'm always quite proactive and I want to address the problems where they are. And so that sort of feeling informed my decision to leave. And to take up a new opportunity with Women Onside in a capacity which is very different from media and journalism, but it still is in pursuit of the same goal, which is trying to make an impact for women and gender diverse people in football, just in lots of smaller, quieter ways.
So you mentioned this idea of, flying the flag in a place you weren't necessarily able to do that as part of your time during the ABC was when you went to Qatar for the 2022 Men's World Cup to cover the tournament. Getting to cover a World Cup, men's or women's, is, one of the things that I think a lot of journalists, want to tick off their bucket list, right? And I've spoken to some people who, despite everything going on in the world, if their bosses ask them to go to the USA to cover the 2026 World Cup, that they're not going to hesitate in saying yes, and that's their prerogative. It's not something I would recommend, but I understand I'm coming at it from a different place than a lot of other people are. But you went to Qatar, you weren't necessarily able to be yourself throughout the time you were there. How did you balance that responsibility?
Yeah, Qatar was really strange. The lead up to traveling there with the ABC crew was very stressful for me. Not only because of the sort of the wider conversations that were happening around the tournament and the real ethical dilemmas about it being hosted in Qatar, but also because there were some pretty active security threats around the tournament as well. I had to do a particular sort of like a training course at the ABC that journalists who go into war zones often have to do. So I had to learn how to like tourniquet a leg and how to, do all these things that might happen if, for example, one of the games was targeted by an extremist organization, if there was a terrorist threat. So that was stressful in itself. But then there was the sort of added layer of, I am a woman. I am a queer woman, I'm a non-binary person, I am going to this place where those identities are not necessarily taken care of, they're not valued, and in the case of being a queer person, they are illegal. So like, how do I feel about that? And what can I do? Like, how do I weigh the pros and cons of being this person and holding these identities and tensions, while also having the opportunity to go and try and tell some important stories about this World Cup for Australia. And ultimately, like I decided to go because it was going to be a really important learning opportunity for me. I'd never covered a major tournament for a major media outlet before. And a tournament like that one I think I went into it with a lot of curiosity, and I think I was able to sort of lean into the fact that I present in quite a traditional feminine way. And so I wasn't worried too much about, like the kind of, the difficulties that might have come my way had I been presenting my gender differently. But also we had a lot of assurances from Football Australia, from the sort of other diplomatic organisations who were involved in the organisation of the tournament, including FIFA, that travelling journalists and travelling fans would be protected, and it would be okay. And ultimately it was it was fine. And you're often so busy at tournaments like that you don't really get very many chances to kind of go out into the world anyway. It's a lot of traveling back and forth to training camps and to games and press boxes and all that kind of stuff, and then back to your room to, write overnight to file for the next morning. But the moments that I did go out into sort of the city centres or to some of the more popular fan sites, I did feel uncomfortable because I'm like a tall, white, tattooed, female presenting person, and they're pretty uncommon in a place like Doha. But I never felt at risk. I never felt in danger. I never, felt any of those things that I was prepared to feel. It was kind of hard to know why, and where the sort of anxiety was stemming from, because I think one of the really interesting things that came off the back of that tournament was a discussion around the difference between the narratives that had been told about Qatar and the reality of being there. It felt at times like it was not a real place. It felt at times like I was on the set of a movie, because I'd read all these things about how terrible conditions were for workers and, the difficulties around the rights for minorities and all these things. And then you would get there and everything would just feel fine. Suspiciously fine. And there were some of the sort of the cities that had been built and the stadiums that had been built for the tournament, which had still, they were so new and so shiny and so clean. It felt like you could walk up to them and push them over and they would fall flat like a stage set. It was a really surreal place to be in that sense. A lot of the kind of discourse from particularly a lot of white Western English speaking journalists, they sort of framed that experience and the tournament as a whole in a particular way. Whereas, you had other journalists who were perhaps a bit more sympathetic to the cultures and communities from that part of the world and the opportunity that hosting a major tournament like this had for them, and sort of counterbalancing a lot of the worries that were, and a lot of the anxieties and sort of ethical issues that were being discussed in another sort of wing of the media. So it was a really interesting time, and I think it took me a very long time after I got back really to sort of unravel a lot of those things for me, to sort of untangle my own experience and try to understand what I really felt and what I really went through, and whether that was a real thing or whether that was part of the stage management of the tournament. Was I actually safe when I went to Doha, or was that just FIFA ensuring that all of the international people who were there for that felt safe? Was that real, or was that something that was designed for us? And I still haven't really landed on an answer with that.
Before we move on from this, it as a lot of things tend to do, the discussion around the tournament blew up on soccer Twitter at different points throughout, particularly the idea of, the safety of queer people and, LGBT people as a whole and everything like that. And sort of, you had, as you said, you sort of had one side that was very much, this is bad. And then you had other side that was just well, enjoy the tournament for what it is, and I think, it's particularly with soccer Twitter, as we know, it tends to get very toxic very quickly. But you were on the ground in Qatar, and I did mention the idea of, balancing the responsibilities of being a queer person whilst, still trying to do an objective job. And someone who was trying to do a job that, wasn't necessarily queer by default was a very vocal ally, was Grant Wall, who, sadly did not make it through the tournament, passing away during a quarterfinal game in Qatar. And he had a lot of struggles throughout the tournament, because he was a very vocal ally, constantly had rainbow gear on him. And, there were points where he was detained, questioned and all those sorts of things. And I guess, you being there on the ground in Qatar, with that sort of going on in the background, and I don't, I'm not sure if your paths would have crossed at any point, but like, what was that experience like?
Look, I made a very deliberate decision when I went to Qatar that I was going to make it as easy as possible for myself to not be bothered. And, that necessarily meant that I was going to suppress the queerer parts of my identity, or the parts of me that I, in other contexts, maybe would have been a lot more vocal or obvious with. I did that, I think, out of self-protection, and the fact that this was my first major tournament. I was still pretty new to this space, and I was going to a country and into a culture that I was still learning a lot about. Like, this was also the men's game, and so I think if this had been a women's World Cup, it would have been an extremely different scenario. Firstly, I don't think it would have been hosted in Qatar. But I think the demographics of the people who went there, I think, would have made me feel a lot safer being myself. And like, credit to Grant, and rest in peace to him as well, for being so brave in doing what he did. But also, like, there was a sort of tension at the heart of that, because he was very deliberate and provocative in some of the things that he was doing, and I think it was partly to make a point about, like, this culture, this country actually is not safe for these people, despite all of the assurances that FIFA have given us. And the experiences that he went through was indicative of that. But I think it sat a little bit awkwardly for me, and potentially for others as well, because, I was there understanding that inclusion is not a race. Every community, every country, every person starts somewhere. And just because they are not where I am doesn't mean that I can poke them or prod them or judge them or, create circumstances that would make them not want to progress, not want them to care and be on this journey with me. And, not everyone will feel the same. Not every queer person, not any person who works in queer spaces will feel that way as I do. I think that, it was a confluence of different factors for me. And like, personal safety really was up there, I think, as the primary thing for me. Maybe that makes me a bad queer. And, the fact that I didn't use my platform to better tell stories about queer people in Qatar, that was something that I did regret when I got home. Was that I wish that I had used my time there to connect more with the queer community, of which there is, quite a blossoming one, and use the opportunity and the platform I had to tell those stories. But I didn't because in the moment I had other priorities, and, I was still sort of learning about the ethics of telling stories about people's experiences who might be in danger as a result of me telling those stories. There was, I think, just a bit too much happening for me there. But if I had my time again, maybe I would think differently about what I would do and the kinds of stories that I would tell. And I'm very grateful that there were some journalists who went over there deliberately wanting to do that, because it was a really important story to tell.
And I guess that gives us a good point to talk about, football media, and then just media more broadly, the challenges that come with being a queer journalist, a gender diverse journalist, in what is still ultimately very much a cis white male dominated industry, although that is changing, and it is changing for the better. But, there is ultimately still a lot of, a lot of the industry that is dominated by straight white men who don't have to go through the sort of challenges that you or I have to go through. How, you talked about balancing that in Qatar, but then how did you sort of balance that, sort of post Qatar with all your sort of, I guess, experience of having to, blend in, so to speak?
I mean, post Qatar, I didn't have to balance it because it was not something that I worried about. This was, I've been a queer person for a very long time. And as I've gotten older, I have come to present myself and live my identity in much clearer ways, in ways that I'm incredibly proud of. And, I think coming back from Qatar, that was a moment in time for me where I knew that I needed to make decisions to keep myself safe. And I did that. And I think a lot of queer people would relate to that experience of being in a space that is not safe. And so needing to do what you can to protect yourself. And if that means passing as a straight person, if that means passing as a cisgender person, if that means, becoming more feminine, if that means becoming more masculine, that's what you need to do in order to stay safe. And ultimately safety is always meant to be the priority. So that's what I did there. But when I came home, this is a very different space. I feel so much safer here. I felt extremely safe at the ABC. I felt extremely safe amongst my own community and my own football club. So I just kind of snapped back like a rubber band, and became who I have always been. It's just that when I was in Qatar, I was performing a different version of myself. And I think that's something that we all have to navigate, regardless of our sexuality or gender identity or presentation. I think we all shape ourselves depending on where we are and who we're around and how safe we feel there. That includes straight cis people as well. Like, all gender is ultimately a performance. It's a series of encoded messages about dress and hair and voice, mannerisms, language, who you talk to, where you go, all of these things are performative decisions that we make that construct our identities for the world. And, those things necessarily have to shift depending on where we are. And, Poletti, you and I, we've moved through football spaces where we've been surrounded by straight white cis men who, may not necessarily make us feel like we can be our full selves. And so we've had to shape ourselves in order to at least feel like we're not going to cause any issues in those spaces, that we're not going to be judged in those spaces, we're not going to be dismissed or belittled in those spaces. And that's what we have to do when ultimately we have a job that we need to get done, and it can be really hard to balance those things. It can be really difficult to feel like you have to shape or suppress parts of your identity in order to achieve a particular job or goal, or to feel like you belong somewhere. It's an ongoing challenge, I think, for the queer community as well as for other people in lots of other minority and intersectional communities. And it's something that I think we'll always have to do, because, this is an industry that is dominated by a particular kind of person, and we are of a community and of an identity presentation that doesn't conform to that. And so, it's important for us to still talk about these things. It's important for us to still be present in these spaces and to form challenges to some of these assumptions and worldviews and standards that may be cemented. But at the same time, it's still important for us to be aware that we need to keep ourselves safe first and foremost.
Yeah, I think that's a lesson that quite often gets forgotten is, that safety is first and foremost the most important thing for queer people, particularly, when you get into unfriendlier spaces. But we'll move on now. And, you ended up, after you left the ABC, at Women Onside in the role of impact manager. You're now I think 7 months into the role, give or take.
Yeah.
What about that role appealed to you, and what does an impact manager actually do? Because it seems like it's a buzzword phrase where it's just like, okay, you make an impact, but what does that actually entail?
Great question. Yeah. So for the folks who don't know, Women Onside is a national not-for-profit advocacy network, which was founded back in 2017 during the Football Australia Congress Wars. So for those who are maybe a little bit newer to the game, back in 2017, the governing body went through this huge issue with its governance and particularly its members. And it culminated in the requirement that they needed to rewrite their constitution. And so as part of that large consultation process, where FIFA also sort of came in over the top and said, y'all need to figure this out because this is not working, a group of women who were informally connected with each other, they'd been involved in Australian football and international football for a very long time, they were invited by FIFA and Football Australia to put together a series of recommendations about how to infuse gender equality principles into the new constitution. So some of those women include Dr. Catherine Ordway, Moya Dodd, Kerry Harris, who's now my board chair, Tal Karp, Nikki Bowman, like some women who have been involved in Australian football in lots of capacities for a very long time. So they worked together, they put together this submission, which included things now known as the 40-40-20 rule, which mandates that the board of Football Australia needs to be made up of 40% men, 40% women, and 20% any gender. A rule that if the chair of the Football Australia board is male, then the deputy chair has to be a different gender. And the establishment of the Women's Football Council, which is a semi-independent body that advocates for women's football within the structure of Football Australia. And all of these recommendations were adopted. So they were written into the constitution of FA, which was an extraordinary thing to happen in 2017-18, like really before the Matildas started to make much noise in terms of the bigger game in Australia. And so these women sort of turned to each other and they were like, holy crap, you know, like if this is what we can do, if this is the kind of change that we can make, and we're just a bunch of friends who know each other and trust each other and work in these spaces, you know, what could we do if we formalized? What could we do if we became like a serious organization that advocates for these things in a sustainable long-term way? And so Women Onside was formed. This is the group that stemmed from those women and their sort of trailblazing actions back in 2017-18. And since then, the organisation has moved on to deliver particular programs around governance training. We do expert webinars. We do in-person events. We share job opportunities. We do a lot of things that try to build community and that try to upskill, educate, advocate for and inspire women and gender diverse people across the sport in lots of different ways, all up and down the pyramid, from governance to coaches to referees to fans to players. We try to sort of cater for everybody in that way. So at the back end of 2024, I was approached by Women Onside, who had created their first ever full-time role, which is called the Impact Manager. And the Impact Manager kind of is just a fancy way of saying the CEO. It's the guy who does everything. You oversee all the programs, you like handle all of the sort of like the operational side of the organization. So you answer to a board and the board sort of steers you in the right direction, but you're the guy who needs to be like, all right, how do we make this real? How do we implement this in a way that's actually going to affect people? And so the past 7 months for me has, like, a lot of the work has been just sitting in the background and being like, okay, what actually do we need to happen in order to make an impact? What needs to be real for us to start making the changes that we want to see? So, like, it doesn't seem on the outside like we've done very much, but there is a lot of different work that's happening in the background, which is going to start to come to fruition around the Women's Asian Cup. So that's sort of our North Star as an organisation. And in the lead up to that, we've done things like partner with research institutions to try and put together some pieces of really important research that hasn't been done anywhere in Australia, assessing the experiences of women and gender diverse people in football. We're partnering with a law firm to become a referral partner for people who are experiencing abuse or harassment or employment discrimination in football. We're doing things like organising a lot of in-person networking events that are going to be tied to the Women's Asian Cup, and opportunities for panels and for activities that allow people to be in a room together, to meet one another and start talking about the issues that affect them. We've revamped our social media. We've done a lot of projects and process work behind the scenes to try and make Women Onside a really sustainable organisation, and to sort of prepare us for what we're anticipating, similar to the Women's World Cup, is going to be a massive influx of people to the sport. So how can we position ourselves in the most strategic way to capture all of those people who flock to the game, but also keep them there and get them to really rally around some of the advocacy and campaigns that we're wanting to run after the Asian Cup is over, that really starts and harks back to that founding story of creating structural change that enables more representation of women in sport.
I promise this will be the last sort of detour we get to before we get, to the flying bats, because I think that's an incredibly important story to tell. But, you mentioned one of the things that you're trying to do with Women Onside, towards the Asian Cup and then after the Asian Cup is these in-person networking events. And we met for the second time at one of those. The first time we'd actually sort of really acknowledged each other person to person, because we were the first time we met, we were simply waiting in line at the Sydney FC game together. And, you gave me some incredible career advice that day that I've sort of taken, sort of like as a guiding light since then. And, this is sort of me just wanting to speak to the power of those sorts of events and, why they're so important. And you mentioned the expert webinars. I've been in on a couple of those as well, as a viewer. And I just can't say enough good things about the work that Women Onside is doing. If people want to, help Women Onside grow, how do they do that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways. So you can go to our website, first and foremost. You can sign up to become a member, which is just $22 a year. So you get access to all of our events, you get access to our webinars, you get access to our newsletter as well. So separately, you can just sign up to our mailing list and get our newsletter once a month, which has got a couple bits and pieces in there from me, which is like an update from HQ, some events that are happening, a bit of a breakdown of a story that's been in the news lately from me, some job opportunities, and a couple of other like cool opportunities that are sort of in the works. Or you can donate. So we're like a donation-driven organisation. The vast majority of the money that we get to pay for my salary and for the other employees that we have at the moment is driven entirely by the community. So if anyone wants to help us and to be part of this bigger mission with us, we really appreciate any contribution that anyone can make, big or small, because each dollar goes towards something that is going to help change sport. So yeah, go to our website, have a bit of a needle around. You can join as a member, or you can donate separately, or you can do both. Ideally, you would do both, because that would be great for us in lots of different ways. So yeah, I hope to see more people signing up soon.
And then it's sort of, I guess, it's an important part of, your journey, but it's also, when it comes to sports media, the elephant in the room, and that is the Flying Bats. And, I'm very proudly wearing my Flying Bats jersey at the moment. Which I don't pull it out every time we record, but I pull it out occasionally, as people will have seen in the past. Because I remember, once upon a time, I remember you saying that you sort of fell out in love with playing the game for a while, and then you found the bats. So I guess we'll start there. What was finding the Flying Bats like for you?
Look, I'd known about the Flying Bats a couple of years before I joined them. When I was freelancing, I had to quit playing community football because a lot of the games that I needed to cover were on Sundays, right? And that's when the community, the women's competitions take place. So I had to step away from playing the community game for a while, which I think came at a good time as well, because I was a little bit over it. I did fall out of love with the game a little bit, and wanted to focus on this other part of my life. And so when I joined the ABC, actually, this was when I returned, and because I was working a lot, I was living by myself, I was completely married to my job, and I wanted to make friends. That was as simple as what it was. And it's really hard to make friends as an adult, I think. I think a lot of people are quite intimidated by the prospect of showing up to a thing with a whole bunch of strangers and saying hi, like, my name is Sam, who are you? But I'd written about the Flying Bats a couple of times. I knew how important they were in the broader landscape, and I'd known a couple of people in my sort of broader social circles who had been involved with the club in the past. And so when I decided that I wanted to get back to playing community football, to try and connect back with a bunch of people and to try and make some new friends, the Bats was the first club that I Googled. I was just like, how do I get involved with this place? I know that they're based in Sydney. What do I do? And so I Googled them, and they were having their annual free come and try sessions throughout the summer months, which was for anyone who was just curious about, what the Bats is about, coming along, having a kick. You don't even need boots. You just come along with some joggers and a water bottle, and yeah, you get to have a run around and have a really great time. So I went along. I found my dusty, cobweb-covered coppers that were in the back of my boot, and I went down to Steel Park in Marrickville, and I rocked up to this group of people who within a couple of minutes I was just like, these are my people. I turned to someone randomly as I was putting my shoes on, and I was just like, hello, is this your first time? And she was like, yep, this is my first time. What's your name? I'm like, I'm Sam. And we're still friends years and years and years later. And it was just such a different feeling to be part of a group of people participating in football at the grassroots level who looked like me and who spoke like me and who played football like me and were interested in the same things that I was interested in and could share jokes with me that were references to queer stuff that I was interested in. And so, yeah, like I within a couple of sessions, I immediately signed up because I just felt so safe there. I felt so seen. I felt so valued. And I felt like I was surrounded by people who really understood the importance of a space like this for each other. So I was extremely grateful to have the opportunity to join them when I did. Jen Peden was the president when I first signed up. And Jen has done so much incredible work for the Bats and for the broader queer community in Sydney in particular. And I think was a really important role model for me when I first joined in showing me what inclusion looks like in really small ways. Like one of the first things I learned from Jen is that at the start of any kind of session, whether it's a summer training session or a regular winter training session or any kind of group session for whatever you're doing, it's always really good practice and inclusive practice to ensure that you ask for people's pronouns. Like that wasn't something that I'd ever really thought about before until I got there. And so, you get in a circle, you say, like, I'm Sam, my pronouns are she, they, and then you would keep sort of going around this, and there's space for that. Like I've maintained that practice for myself in every group like bonding session that I've ever run, whether it's related to football or not. And for some people, they're questioning what their pronouns are. They're exploring it. They're trying to figure it out. And that's okay. Like, this is a space where that is encouraged. It's completely fine if you don't know the answer to that question. What matters is that you speak to each other with respect and with the way that that person wants to be spoken to. So you ask for pronouns, you ask for chosen names, which might be different from the name that's on a registration or a birth certificate. And you just respect that. You respect that this is a space for people to explore themselves and their identities and to come to a better understanding about who they are and the way that they want to live in the world. And so, like, that part of it for me was so different from the kind of community football that I had experienced for my whole life up until that point. I had to hide the fact that I was a queer person when I was growing up playing. I had my first girlfriend who was in my football team when I was at Escol Park, but we couldn't acknowledge it to any of our teammates. We had to pretend like we were just friends and that we didn't really know each other. Whereas on the outside of the club, like we were dating. And that was always really stressful for me to have to hide that part of myself. And it affects the way that you play as well. If you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like you can be your true full self, you're not going to be able to play with joy, which is always the way that you play best. And so at the Bats, it's something that I've really tried to, since I've taken over as president, implement in lots of different ways and to really encourage a lot of the folks who are leaders in our club. I mean, everyone's a leader, but our committee members, our coaches, our managers, our captains, to really ensure that there is that culture that we maintain, that culture that I felt as soon as I stepped into that first summer training session, and make sure that everyone feels safe and welcome.
You telling that story that, like Jen guiding you through that just made me think of, back to when, before the, when I interviewed a lot of the Paramatildas players prior to them going to the World Cup, was and Eno Dong. We all got into a circle, the handful of journalists that were there, the players, and sort of all went around in the circle and introduced ourselves. And when it came to me, Poletti, they, them. And as that was said, and then after that happened, when I was interviewing the different players, like when some of them would come up to me, it was just like, hey, I'm, such and such, are you she, her? And it's just like, it's just that little bit of acceptance, right? It's the things that you don't, like, it's, how do I word this? I guess it's sort of like, it's the little things, right? Where it's just like, I've never really had anyone do that before. I go around the room and I'll tell people my pronouns when, I'm in a new place, but like, it's never sort of, I don't know if acknowledge is the right word, but it's sort of like, it's just kind of like, it's there, it's part of me. And like, I generally get treated with respect, but it's just like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, and I hope the listeners know what I'm trying to say as well. So it's just nice to have that little sort of thing, to go with it. And then you talked about moving into being president of the Flying Bats as well. And we've spoken, at length already in this podcast about the idea of, of burnout and all the challenges that come with it and the difficulties of the role. And you're managing, this massive organization, in your full-time work. And you take on the role of president of the Flying Bats, a club that, as we touched on off the top, has sort of had a lot of hit pieces written against it by very conservative voices because of the fact, it's an openly queer club. You openly accept trans and gender diverse individuals as part of your club, as part of your teams. Why did you feel it, like, making the move into president was the right move for you, knowing all the stresses that come with what is ultimately an unpaid role of a football club?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple of different factors that came into it for me. The first was that I joined the committee because I feel like the club had given me so much and I wanted to give something back. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to give what is everyone's most precious thing, which is their time, to something that had given me so much. It had given me friends, it had given me purpose, it had given me community, it had given me so many things that I had been searching all of my life for. And so I felt I owed them that kind of debt. I felt like I owed them something back. So I joined the committee under Jen, and that first year was when a lot of these difficulties really started. We had a team in the Women's Premier League that had a number of trans and gender diverse people in it, including me. I was there as one of those team members, and that was a team that was largely targeted because we were a really good team. We weren't a great team because we had trans players. We were a great team because we had great players. And we all worked together in order to have a really fantastic season. The first sort of undefeated championship winning season that team had in years. All the factors sort of came together. So yeah, I was vice president then under JP. And so I was sort of at the coalface in terms of dealing with a lot of those things as they were happening and reacting to them. It's one thing to volunteer for a community sports club as a first step and the exhaustion and time commitment that comes with that. But it's another step altogether to be a volunteer for the Flying Bats, because we're not just a community sports club. We are a trailblazing organisation. It's our 40th anniversary this year. We were founded in 1985, which makes us the biggest and the longest running queer women's and non-binary soccer club in the country. Maybe even sports club. I don't know of any other codes that have a club like ours that stretches back that far. And there's a lot that comes with that. You are advocates. You are a visible symbol in the broader community about what inclusion looks like. And so there's a lot of thought and care and work that goes into being that as well. And a lot of risk, which is what we've had to deal with over the past sort of 18 months, in particular, 2 years. There's a lot of risk. And now that the world around us has shifted in the way that it's talking about inclusion, especially of trans and gender diverse people, we've always been following the rules. We've always been doing the things that the policies have said we're allowed to do. It's just that our context has changed. And so it's shone a really harsh spotlight onto our most marginalised players. And as a result of that, we've had to be really proactive in trying to protect them and therefore to protect the broader community, not just at the club, but beyond our club as well. So that was something that when I stepped into the presidency after JP stood aside, that I was really adamant I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that we came into a new season being really prepared, understanding exactly the risks that were sort of surrounding us based on the experiences that we'd had in the last season, and ensuring that all of our players were as protected as possible. So we worked really closely with Pride Cup over a couple of months to develop our first ever risk management strategy, which is a big document that all members have access to, which talks about what do you do when X happens? What do you do when you face online harassment and abuse from anti-trans campaigners? What do you do if you're filmed without your consent at a game? What do you do if you face transphobic or homophobic abuse from supporters on the sidelines? You know, these are things that there are a number of people and other clubs across the country who face it, but we face it every day. We face it all the time. And, you know, that's a real burden to carry. It adds such a layer of anxiety and stress to what should be a space of joy and freedom and community and connection. And so, you know, that's taken a real toll, I think, on a lot of folks who are in leadership positions, who are sort of the public face of the club and having to be that barricade between the outside world and the members. But again, I do it because this club has done so much for me. Like I am the living proof of what this organisation means and how it can change people's lives. And I want to make sure that that's still possible. I want to make sure that this is a space that still feels safe and still allows people the chance to discover who they are and to find such a profound sense of belonging when they might not have that in any other way, in any other area of their lives. So that's like a sacrifice that I'm willing to make, I guess you can say. Like I'm willing to spend all this time and all this energy creating this space and being that barrier between my club and the rest of the world, because it matters. You know, it matters not just for us, but it matters for the rest of the community. It matters for all of the gender non-conforming people who are out there in the world who have always looked at sport and felt like it's not for them. You know, the community sport plays such an important role in the health and well-being of everybody, let alone the folks who are the most marginalised and actually need that sense of community the most. And so, yeah, like we're driven by a real sense of purpose in that way, and understanding the power that we have as a club. Even though we're all volunteers, we all have full-time jobs elsewhere. We're all doing as much as we can, and giving as much as we can to try and maintain this club and this community that has meant so much to so many of us.
Yeah, I remember quite vividly, you know, when the problems, I guess, and I use the term, you know, in quotation marks, sort of started, and because I can recall attending a Flying Bats game. It was a Sapphire Cup game. It was an early stages Sapphire Cup game, and you know, you had to change venues at the last minute because of, you know, this threat, because you'd had, you know, an article, a hit piece article written like not even a week prior, and I remember there being a police presence at the venue. A community sporting venue, mind you, that has visibly, you know, a police presence. And, you know, we're not going to get into the idea of, you know, police and queerness and, you know, all that sort of debate, because that's something that I don't feel comfortable tackling. And again, it's probably another 2-hour podcast by itself. And I remember tweeting about the game because, you know, I wanted to share the story of the game. I wanted to share the story of the Bats. And I remember, you know, where I was sitting, I was sort of sitting away from everyone. I was a little bit, you know, under the weather at the time. But it was a very cold city night, and so I'm wearing multiple layers of black jackets. You know, I'm sort of hidden off to the side under a hood, and it's kind of like, I didn't think at the time the look that might present. And in the end, I ended up, you know, spending some more time with the players after the game, you know, chatting. It's like, oh, you're the person who was tweeting throughout the game. And I'm like, yes. I'm a good ally. Don't get me, like, I'm the good person. Like, I'm not one of the bad people here. But you know, it didn't occur to me at the time how that might look, given everything that was going on. And then, about a year later, the club was making a deep run in the Champions of Champions, which for those who don't know is a Football New South Wales annual tournament where the champions from each league in each district around the Football New South Wales ecosystem all play off in a knockout tournament. And after the Flying Bats got knocked out in the semi-final, we had a conversation at that game, and you talked about it being relief that you were knocked out in a semi-final, which is not something that you'd ever think would come from a football competition, just because you didn't want to have to deal with anything that might come had you made it to the final of the Champion of Champions.
Yeah, exactly. Competitions like that are like wonderful to participate in. It's really great to test ourselves at those kinds of levels and against teams that are outside of our association. But with those competitions comes increased risk, increased profile, increased coverage, which is ironic, right? Because we always talk about how much we want there to be more coverage of women's football at these levels. And yet for us, it's this dilemma of like the more coverage we get, the more at risk our players are. And we were also just exhausted. That was such a big season for us in lots of different ways. So when we got to that semi-final against Coogee United, who went on to win the whole thing, I'm pretty sure, I think a lot of us were already kind of resigned to the fact that we didn't want to continue. Because had we reached the final, it would have fed into this broader narrative that was being told about us, which is that we were this all-dominating football team who had players that they believed were not, meant to be there. They believed that these players were not women. It was for me, it was a relief to no longer have to be in that spotlight, because one of the things that we have noticed, particularly over this most recent season, is that we never get any coverage when we lose. We never get any attention when we play badly. We never get any negativity, any criticism. None of these anti-trans campaigners say a peep when the things that we do actually don't conform to the narrative that they want to tell about us. They just cherry pick information, they shape things in order to suit their worldview, and then when something goes against that, complete silence. I think that had been such a long season. It had been emotionally very difficult for this team as well, given all of the attention that was on us. But ultimately, we were beaten by a much better team. Like, they ran absolute rings around us, Coogee. My God. It was really great to be part of a game where, like, we were beaten by, like, such a great team. It was really cool to see the way that they played, and to be humiliated right in the middle of that midfield with them. So, that's it. That's football, right? Like, yes, we're a team that might be very good in one competition, but we're not very good in another competition. And like, that's the way that it works. But that's not the story that a lot of these media articles and a lot of these anti-trans campaigners have been wanting to tell. They don't actually pay attention to football. A lot of them are not part of football in any way. They're on the outside making assumptions about who we are based on very, very small examples and information that they warp to suit the narrative that they want to tell. And that's tiring. But it's also given us an opportunity to think really strategically about how do we want to counteract those narratives? What do we want to say about ourselves? Instead of just hiding away like we've done in the past and waiting for the storm to go across over us, how can we actually meet these people on the battlegrounds of storytelling? What can we do that allows us to feel like we have autonomy and power in shaping these stories about ourselves? So that's formed part of our strategy as well. Like, we have made very deliberate attempts to connect with different media organizations and have stories told about us that are real and true, and show all of the really important things that we're actually doing in the community. Doing this podcast is part of that. I've been doing a couple of other podcasts. We've also got a segment with ABC 7:30 that's going to be released sometime in the next couple of weeks, talking about a lot of the things that we've just been talking about today. And all of that is like deliberate. It's all part of our our attempt to try and wrestle control of our story back from people who actually don't want to tell that story truthfully.
I can speak for myself and the rest of the Round Ball Australia team and the Dubcast crew that, we're very grateful to be able to, share that story and, have these sorts of conversations with our platform. It's been a marathon podcast by, your standard podcast length, but everything we've talked about is incredibly important to talk about, and I'll end the same way I like to end all of my interviews. Is there anything that you want to talk about that I haven't necessarily talked about yet?
Oh, gosh. Again, there are so many spin-off episodes that we could probably put together based on some of the topics that we've covered today. I think what I would want to leave saying is that, the way that the media is evolving around the women's game, not just in Australia, but around the world, is incredibly exciting. It might feel like at the moment here, it's a little bit down in the dumps, that maybe not a lot of things have changed. But compared to when I started, it's chalk and cheese. There are so many people involved in women's football in Australia now who have amazing skills, who want to be part of telling stories, who want to share their experiences, who want to create content in really fun and engaging ways. So just because we might not see our voices and our stories being told on mainstream platforms, it doesn't mean they're not being told elsewhere. And I think podcasts like this one and what you're doing at the Round Ball is the perfect example of that. This is version 2.0 of the Women's Game website. This is the same stuff that we were doing back in the day when there wasn't any other alternative. But now, there is this blossoming landscape and all of these different outlets, independent outlets, individual freelancers, people who are starting to tell these stories, and a lot more community appetite to consume them. So I guess my advice to anyone who's listening is that if you want to tell stories about women's football in Australia, tell them. Find the platform that you want to tell them on and tell them, because there is absolutely an audience ready and willing to lap it all up. And come the Women's Asian Cup in March of next year, we're going to see Women's World Cup 2.0 in terms of the way that the country gets around that tournament and the amount of attention that's paid to women in football in Australia. So get into it, start telling these stories. The more voices that we have, especially the more diverse voices that we have in these spaces, the better. And I'm really looking forward to reading and listening and watching and consuming everything that people come up with, because we are stronger when we are together.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. A very wise person who I consider a friend once told me, if it matters to you, it will matter to someone else. And I think that's something we can all take into our storytelling. And I'm very proud to have spent the last 90 or so minutes interviewing that friend of mine. You can hear Sam's work, on ESPN's The Far Post podcast. You can, read about what she's doing at Women Onside and follow her on social media to keep across all of that. Sam, thank you so much for giving us time today.
Thank you, Poletti. It's a pleasure.
And that will do it for this episode of the Dubcast, part of the Round Ball Australia podcast network. We thank you once again for joining us. A conversation with Sam Lewis is an incredibly important conversation to have, even if we didn't necessarily talk about the on-field action with football, but rather the stories around it. As always, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed that conversation and want to see more of what we do. The little notification bell as well, so you can get notified, particularly during the off-season, when new episodes drop. As we've talked about previously, the timeline of these episodes dropping does become a little bit infrequent. But we will be back next week to chat about a number of topics, including Melbourne City and Melbourne Victory applying to be part of the NPL women's competition in Victoria, Auckland's A-League women's team being delayed until the 2027-28 season, and anything else that pops up in the meantime. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Goodbye.